and welcome back to Talking Behaviour, where I am Charlie, and with me is
James, hello.
and we are your hosts for the evening, and we will basically be explaining to you a new format for the episodes because we've had some feedback and we want to make sure that we adjust and adapt accordingly to make this the most interesting and smooth listening experience as possible. So we're going to be covering one topic today, James, okay? We're going to be covering sensory processing and self-stimulatory behaviour, okay? Do you know anything about that?
No.
Okay. What about the word sense?
I know we've got sensors.
That's
We've got
good.
several of them. Five
Excellent.
of them.
5 senses. Amazing.
Yeah.
Starting with 5.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. What if I told you there were more than 5?
You see ghosts.
No.
No. Okay.
No. 6 senses, slightly different. Completely understand why you would go to that. What about when you close your eyes? Do you know where your hands are?
Yes.
It's called proprioception, right?
That's
So
the sixth sense.
That's one of them.
Okay.
And then there's vestibular movement, right, which is when you move your body and you can feel it through your body rather than actually having it as a touch.
Alright,
Right.
like a roller coaster ride, you feel yourself.
Yeah. That
Okay.
feeling actually is itself, and that actually is an endorphin rush that you're feeling there because actually what is happening is your organs are jiggling, which is hurting you, right? Because that happens, and your body is going, this is, which is why you go, a little bit of sensory input to make you feel better and not think about the fact that your organs just jiggle.
And what was that called?
That is an endorphin rush. So it's what
rush.
happens when you do exercise as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then they say endorphins are to like reward you for the exercise. No. It's a pain thing, right? It stops you from feeling it, right? Okay, so there we go. That's 2 of the other senses. There's more. There's like 14 if I remember correctly, but I can't remember all of them in the list, so I'm not going through them today. But there we go. I'll probably get that out at some point.
Another podcast.
Amazing news. So, what about the word sensory processing?
Is that how
brain.
you react, or not react, how your brain takes in the effect or the thing that is happening and how it wants to react to it?
Yeah, I think that there's probably a thing that actually is in between that, which is sensory input, right? What would you think about that? That's something that maybe you pick up through one of those things, right?
Yeah.
So then you have sensory input, sensory processing being how you perceive that and how you understand it, how you're able to actually allocate it towards the correct thing and get the correct information out of it, right? And then what about sensory regulation?
I mean, regulation is just like how you, not react to things, but how you monitor and make sure that you react accordingly.
Yeah, it's interesting because regulation is actually about whether the system is receiving the right inputs and outputs to stay consistent. So if you have a system like sensory processing, you might receive too much input and it might push you over the regulatory level, right, and make you feel overstimulated. Right.
Okay.
So your level of regulation is how much of the input that you're processing correctly, allowing you to stay regulated. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you have a regulatory level in the middle of something, okay? So then you have things like stimulation, the stimuli in the environment, which are giving you input through your various senses, which you're perceiving, and then you are processing this information, and it is affecting your regulation, right? So what some people do, for example, if they might have autism or autism and a learning disability, this is more you might see self-stimulatory behaviour, which is someone who basically does behaviour which produces its own input, right? Sensory-wise, you move your hands, which gives you proprioceptive input. You move your body and rock so that you get that vestibular input.
Right. And they do that because they feel like they're not getting enough from their environment.
They are understimulated.
Okay.
Exactly. So these people have learned to normalise a level of input from the environment, which the new environment that they've gone into is not providing. So what do? They produce that normalised level of input.
They have to create their own.
Correct. Which is exactly what we do as people, right? And this is why this is such an interesting thing. So the change in format, James, is that we're going to be talking about one topic, and this is the first of 3 episodes. And we're going to go first over sensory processing and self-stimulatory behaviour, and then in future we'll be talking about over and under stimulation. And that's a nice little 3 episode set for everybody, so look out for that one. Okay? So what we're going to talk about today is why this is important, especially when talking with people with learning disabilities and intervention, and what you might see with people who are not regulating themselves or who might not be receiving the right inputs to stay regulated, right? This is going to be the basis for kind of an understanding around overstimulation versus understimulation and pushing over that barrier of toleration, right?
Yeah.
So hopefully this should give us the whole thing all the way through. You guys can always let us know if we don't get through that, okay? So sensory processing allows us to effectively understand what is coming in from our environment, right? You have auditory input coming from things which you might recognize based on previous history. That auditory input will allow you to identify what is happening without having to look at it, right? The more that you have in terms of like language around this stuff, the more that your cognition is able to kind of correctly allocate this stuff. So if you have a learning disability and you have a reduction in cognitive ability, you find that people might not be able to process their environment quite so well. They might not be able to tell what that noise is or recognize it, and that might cause them to become dysregulated as they search for the answer. Right? So you might see with people with autism that they are more disturbed by things inside of their environment, especially if they cannot identify where it's coming from, what it is, or why it's there.
Yeah, so unexpected sounds, scary.
Yeah, sounds, visuals, anything like that, like flashing lights. It might be that somebody doesn't have epilepsy, but they do not like watching all these very highly input visual activities, like watching, ADHD focused content, for example, tends to be a lot about getting a lot of input, right? These people will get overstimulated when they do these things, and it will push them over that barrier of regulation. It will cause them to be overstimulated, and they will engage in behavior to try and kind of like get back into that regulatory level. The problem can sometimes be that people might learn to actually enjoy being in a certain state that is not fully regulated.
Okay.
You sometimes find people who enjoy the overstimulation area. You talked a bit about the roller coaster thing, right? That's kind of like an adrenaline junkie, right, thing. And that's effectively saying that you like being scared, right? Most people who haven't been exposed to being scared in a safe environment and then conditioned through repeated exposure would be like, maybe not be scared all the time. But you, who is a person who likes going and doing that, have experienced it safely, know it's safe, and then can go and expose yourself to it regularly enough to actually be able to regulate it properly.
Yeah. Whereas somebody who doesn't necessarily understand those things will react obviously very differently and get a different output out of it.
Yeah, and what you get from this is that every person has their own boundaries in these levels, right? The level of regulation for one person could be very thin, right? You have to stay exactly between these two levels to stay regulated. Another person, it could be very wide. You can stay within this level and you won't go over the appropriate, input or output level. And the way that this develops is exposure, right? This is the problem of people being underexposed to places because they do things in those places and then they lose access to them. This means that they don't get that input and they might not be able to regulate that input when they are exposed to it later.
Right. Okay.
So this is, you have a tantrum in the shop, you stop taking the kid to the shop, right? The kid is now not going into that fluorescent light, slightly colder environment and learning to kind of regulate in that activity regularly. Now when winter comes, they cannot tolerate cold.
Okay.
Yeah, you're seeing how this kind of process is
cascade.
Yeah, it's more extreme in people who have learning disabilities because again, I would describe it as a perceptive, understanding, cognitive issue, right? They are perceiving all of the same stuff depending upon their ability to like hear and see, or feel their body inputs. But they are less able to process multiple things going on at once, or they're less able to identify what those things are and are easier dysregulated by them, right? And so this leads you to every individual has to be assessed, right, for what their input-output variables are.
Yeah.
Right? Like I'm sitting here in this nice spinny chair because I like kind of like moving the spinny chair, and I'm also sitting with my legs crossed because that provides input into my body. That's a normalized input level. If I wasn't doing those things, I would be more twitchy than I was now, right? So a very good thing to be doing while you're podcasting, for example, right? You asked earlier if you could sit in this chair. No.
This is my throne.
There's a reason I'm in this chair. And I think it's relevant, to the conversation. There's a reason I have a coffee next to me when I'm doing it, because it will just give me that boost and kind of get me into that regulatory element that I need to be able to do this.
I guess a slight question. This is on a more directed directly at you rather than the science behind it. In your experience, I would say, just from my instinct, says that the two most obvious and the two most affecting inputs are sound and sight. Those ones that would most likely kick off, but obviously touch would be a big one. Have you ever had experience that smell could influence something like that as
Hmm.
well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting because you saw me shaking my head or nodding my head at different points. Touch is probably the biggest one,
Really?
right? Because you actually have much less exposure to touch from other people on a day-to-day basis, especially if you're someone who cannot request for a hug or cannot request for input, right?
Yeah.
Often the input that you get from other people is the most motivating thing. So you will be seeking it a lot, and when you get refused, the value of it goes up, right?
Right.
Considering motivation that we talked about last time, right? So, yeah, all of these things can become a thing. There are people who cannot process olfactory, which is what you're talking about, smell. And if you're wearing strong perfume or you're wearing aftershave, that makes them have a more behaviors that challenge that day or behaviors of concern,
Yeah.
right? Because they cannot process why it always smells like flowers around them right now, and only when you show up,
Yeah.
right?
That's crazy that it can influence, but I never even really thought about smell in particular. That is something that you can see some behaviors happening
Mm-hmm.
and be like, oh, but all of these other things are the same, and not even realize that it's just
Very.
the perfume.
Yeah, because you could actually look at things like this is one of the tricks that you can get with data where if you look at only one situation and you don't take enough data, you can actually sometimes draw the wrong conclusion, right? Because you might see a situation like that where someone's got a perfume on one day and be like, it's the person that they don't like. And when the person goes to and from, this causes them to have the behavior, which means they don't like the person. But then if you took that data over a couple of days and they didn't wear the perfume on day 3, right? And it stops on day 3, and nothing else has changed, you can then reduce those variables down to what is actually the problem. Oh, seriously, you didn't put perfume on today, and that's why this person's having a bad day. Okay, very simple. You cannot put perfume on the days that you're scheduled with that. I'm really sorry. You know, I know that you have a right to do these things if you want to work with someone else on those days. Fair enough. But you know, sometimes the needs of the service will require you to stay with people. That's kind of part of the job when you are in a service-based industry, you
Of
know?
course, yeah.
Any ones on that? Did that make
Yeah,
sense?
no, that all made good sense. Yeah.
I'm feeling good about it at least. Okay, so this basically gives you the whole process, right? Is you have a regulatory level. It can be any kind of variety of things based upon your previous history, what kind of inputs you seek, and your attitude towards those levels can be completely independent from this, right? You might not actually enjoy the process of feeling regulated. You might be so used to being overstimulated because you end up overstimulated 60 to 90% of the time, right? And now that's your normal, and you can only ever go down 2 levels, and 2 levels is bad for you, and 1 level down is pretty bad for you. You don't enjoy it, but everybody else seems to be implying that you need to be in it because otherwise you're constantly seeking things. Or if you were overstimulated, I suppose it would be that you would be constantly seeking to reduce the input that you're getting. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so you end up with these things called sensory diets. When you're working in the industry, you have a person who has their profile, you get their profile very specific, you know what kinds of inputs they require to be regulated. You can very quickly see if one of those steps isn't done, then this thing starts happening, right? And you can program in activities which have inputs built into them, right? So I always go for a walk in the morning. I make sure that one of the first things I do when I wake up is to wash my hands because water through my hands helps me to regulate. When I feel like I've got dirt on my hands, I actually don't regulate so well. All of these things were very difficult to identify previous to my diagnoses, right? Because when I wasn't medicated for ADHD, I didn't feel any of this, right? And then I got that, and I was like, why do I feel like I'm on fire all the time? And then the autism gets diagnosed, and I start actually looking after myself a bit more, and it's like, oh, okay, you can feel okay because you just need to do these things, and people can tell you your entire life that you need to do them, but it's the things which work for you. It's not necessarily what other people are telling you to do.
Yeah.
It's like people can be like, you should go to the gym. It's like, no, I like going for a walk in the morning right now. It will probably turn into something else, you know. A couple of walks a day actually currently, so we're improving as we're going.
Nice.
Obviously, work builds its own stuff into it, so often people's work week will give them the input that they need from a lot of places. And because work is a condition that requires certain behaviours and repudiates other certain behaviours, it will basically often be where a lot of these inputs that you have to tolerate are built into your week. So you can see that when people say lose their job, they might end up stuck in a situation for a long period of time where they're not receiving any of those inputs anymore. And that person begins to dysregulate. right? Then, when they do start going back to work or trying to get themselves back into the process of doing stuff, they find it very difficult to do those things.
Yeah, of course you would struggle.
And sometimes that's like a little bit of undergeneralization, which is the ability to do things in one environment that has not been trained, but you were taught to do in a trained environment, right? That's one version of generalization. There's a few of them. This basically is quite interesting because you get people who will be very self-deprecating because of these things, and they should not be. It's the environment, and it's a lack of understanding about what the environment is doing to them, which is leading to that thing. Yeah, as much as it is themselves, because learning history, all that stuff. But yeah, people should be a bit kinder to themselves about that, I think, because if you're not doing it, it's because either it's too difficult to do it right now, or it's not providing enough for you. Yeah. I think that's probably the first topic, James.
I agree.
Yeah,
I think it's good.
Anything that you want to ask before we finish up?
No. It's all going to lead on nicely, I think. So
yeah, I think so too. Honestly, I think that this was good, and I'm looking forward to releasing the next one. See you next time, everybody. Have a good one.